There's a small town in northern Kentucky that houses secrets, a ritual that those who have lived there for generations are immune to. For a newcomer, this would be an initiation. Outsiders are most welcome in the small town, but they should be careful not to break the one rule. Don't venture around the town at night. This rule isn't announced, but you can hear it whispered within the small town, in shops, restaurants, or just passers-by on the streets. You have to listen closely, but it's meant to be that way, and the warning signs are there. Before the three siblings, Corey, Reagan, and Micah, moved to this small town, they had hoped for a life that would slow down time, one that wasn't full of things to do every moment. The idea of being surrounded by nature was also a must in their shared vision, but it all seemed like a pipe dream, like winning the lottery. Fun to talk about, but neither of the three thought it would ever happen. Just as their hopes of this life dwindled, Corey, being the mother figure of her younger siblings, found the house and instantly fell in love with the town surrounding it. When she had told her brother and sister about it, they thought she was just dreaming big again. They humored her, but didn't take Corey all that seriously this time. They had tried to get other homes out in the country, but for one reason or another, it always fell through. They were giving up hope fast. This time, it seemed like it was meant to be, as if something was looking out for them. They would learn over the coming months that this blessing was by design, and it was no blessing at all. They would be the intended victims of what would become a walking nightmare. After settling into their new home on the outskirts of the old town, the three siblings went into the older part of town, the most appealing section. Going from shop to shop, everyone was so friendly, greeting them with smiles and a genuine small town feel. This was perfect. The buildings were all of an older design, brick structures which stood for more than 200 years. They walked around peering into the small businesses, just enjoying the day. After several hours, hunger set in, so they stopped into the local dairy bar for a bite to eat. The family-owned restaurant felt so cheery and alive. The staff was friendly and the atmosphere was bright. As they sat eating their hamburgers, Reagan and Micah admitted that Corey had really come through this time. This was exactly what they needed. This made Corey grin from ear to ear. All she wanted was for the best for all of them, and feeling their approval of the new move was all she needed to feel fulfilled. As they sat in the diner, there was chatter going on all around them, normal conversations at a low muffle. Each voice was indistinguishable from the next. Without looking around, they figured the place was packed. It had not been when they walked in, though. When they entered the diner, there were only 3 other people in the place, and they were all sitting alone at separate tables. As they sat chatting among themselves, they basked in the ambiance of the new town they would call home, fixated on eating their meal and talking with one another, not bothering to look around. One bit of whispering caught Micah's attention. Coming from a larger town previously, Micah was always on guard, not in a defensive manner, but he liked listening in on other people's chatter. Not to be nosy, he just liked seeing if he could make out what people were talking about. But when he heard what sounded like a father whispering to his child, he took notice and focused his attention on it.
I told you we weren't allowed in town at night. I'm so sorry.
Then the voice trailed off into a low hum that blended in with the other voices. Then all the voices began trailing off until silence. Micah jerked his head around quickly, looking all around the tiny diner. There were still just the same 3 people that had been there when they walked in. As Micah made eye contact with them one at a time, each would revert their eyes, and each had the same look on their faces, a look that wasn't easily deciphered. Micah leaned in to his 2 sisters sitting across from him. "Did you guys hear all those people talking?" Corey and Reagan looked at each other curiously. "Yeah? So?" Reagan quickly responded. Micah sighed. "Look around." They had all been so fixated on their own conversations and hunger that they had not noticed. "What the hell?" Reagan blurted out with a chuckle, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's quiet now. Maybe they all left," Corey responded. None of them wanted to acknowledge that there was anything strange going on. The food was good and the atmosphere was so warm and inviting. However, Micah knew what he heard, and the lack of humans in the establishment to create all those voices was startling, to say the least. The trio finished their meal and left the restaurant, hopping back into their car to head home. As they were driving, Micah told his sisters about the voices he had heard. He then asked the girls, "Did any of you see anyone come in or leave? Do you remember seeing anyone else even there?" Reagan, being the headstrong middle child, had no problem with being the voice of reason. "Micah, there were other people there. We all heard them." Micah explained to them what he had heard from that man talking to his child. "Micah, you're being paranoid again," Reagan interrupted. "Yeah, Micah, you probably misunderstood what he said or something," Corey added. Thinking back on it, Micah now wondered if he had heard it correctly even. So, like his sisters, he brushed it off, but not without feeling dismissed and a little jarred. No matter if he heard the voices correctly or not, there were voices of people who were not visible. Even if they didn't admit it, his sisters were a little troubled by it as well. But making Micah feel a little crazy was one of the ways they would razz their younger brother, so they just played it off like it didn't happen. A couple weeks later, they ventured into town again. They needed groceries, and there was this coffee shop that they had heard had the best coffee and donuts around. And it must be true. The line was out the door the moment the place opened. Inside, the smells of coffee and sweet donut filling crowded their senses. The cafe was slightly darker inside than the diner had been, but it still felt just as cozy. The voices of the other patrons, although muffled and low, echoed throughout the establishment. One voice, just one voice, stood out. A whisper that felt as if it was right up against their ears. Simultaneously, they could feel the breath.
"Don't let the night fall."
They all tried to play it off like some sort of prank, but there was no one close enough to have done this. Corey and Reagan looked at Micah with confused looks. Micah carried the same expression but quickly changed. His thoughts could be seen on his face. He knew they had heard it this time. "See, I told you," he shouted to his sisters in the crowded coffee shop. They knew he was right about the diner this time. They just wouldn't let on. Afraid it would feed into his cautious senses and he would try to leave the town for good. This town was perfect, and they didn't want each other to feel otherwise. But this time it couldn't be ignored. They couldn't spin it to be in Micah's imagination. They had reacted, and Micah saw that. When they finally got their coffee, they couldn't help but think all the rumors were true. This was the best coffee their tongues had had the pleasure of experiencing ever. And the coffee was almost good enough to ignore what they had all heard from that strange voice. Almost. There was something weird going on in this town. The question all three had was what to do about it. Is there anything they could do about it? It was something they could have just misheard or didn't understand the context. Nothing to raise any real alarms about, but their curiosity was starting to get the best of them. Even if it turned out to be nothing at all, there was an adventure to be had from this. When they got home from their coffee run, Reagan was first to speak up. "Yeah, I'm going to the town tonight." Corey didn't waste any time in responding. "Yeah, I was thinking the same thing." Micah was a little less enthusiastic about this haphazard idea. "I don't know. Something doesn't feel right. I don't think we should do this." The sisters should have expected this kind of response from him, and they kind of did. They were prepared. Micah wasn't known for taking chances, especially when the risk outweighed the reward. Corey scuffed Micah's hair a little bit playfully. "Come on, I'll make a deal with you. We won't get out of the car. We'll just drive through the town really quick and come back.
There's probably nothing to worry about anyway.
Reagan chimed in, smiling excitedly at her brother.
Micah, come on, this'll be fun.
Micah rolled his eyes. I'll go, but I still think it's a bad idea. Night set on the neighborhood. Nervous anticipation grew as they made their way to the car sitting idly in the driveway. Reagan and Micah usually fought over who would sit in the front seat, but not this time. Micah was perfectly fine with allowing that honor to go to Reagan. The back seat added a bit of comfort in security. He really didn't want to do this. Not that he was afraid, he just thought it was a bad idea. Although he tried to tell himself that it would probably just be a lame adventure, he was always being dragged around to these different adventures that turned out to be nothing. But still, if he were to tell his sisters that he had no fear, he would be lying. He could try to lie to his sisters all he wanted, but he knew he was lying to himself. This just felt different than all those other times. As they drove toward the town, the stars were brighter than they had ever seen them. Shooting stars streaked the sky in magnificent brilliance, one by one. The moon was also bright, really bright. It wasn't quite full, but the light given from it was enough to give the treetops an eerie glow. The wind was just strong enough to make the treetops sway, casting dancing shadows across the road, as if they were performing a well-rehearsed routine meant to calm their audience into some false sense of security, mesmerize them even. The drive toward town was mostly uneventful. The dark road leading to town seemed longer than usual, though. Instead of taking 5 minutes to reach the diner, it took 10 minutes. This detail was slight enough that it went unnoticed. As they reached the main street, there was definitely something odd going on. The sidewalks were lined with pedestrians walking toward the town center in single file. Families generally walked side by side. Not here. Even the children were walking between their parents in this line. Closer and closer the siblings drove slowly toward the town. The closer they got, the more people they saw walking single file. They didn't realize there was this many people in this town, let alone this many people walking at 10 o'clock at night. It was strange, to say the least. As they approached the town, they noticed barricades in the road ahead. Attending them were local police officers. Inside the car came talks of what this could mean. They all decided that it was probably some town social gathering. They were new here and didn't understand the events that took place. As they inched closer to the barricades, they stopped. A police officer approached their car. As he drew closer, there was something odd. His expression, or lack thereof. His movements were stiff, jerky, as if he were being forced to take each step. Corey rolled down her window as the officer seemed to just appear beside her. 1 second, he was 5 feet from the front of her car. The next, he was right next to her.
Proceed on foot or take the detour,
the police officer said in a deep monotone voice as he pointed to an offshoot road to the right.
Officer, what's going on here?
Reagan said with a hint of sarcasm while leaning across Corey. He repeated his statement.
Proceed on foot or take the detour.
Micah was sitting in the back witnessing everything in silence. If he wasn't unnerved before the officer spoke, he was now. Corey, you promised we would stay in the car, he finally let out.
Micah, don't you want to see what's going on here? It looks like a party,
Reagan spat out excitedly. Micah sat in place, upset for a second. He didn't even want to go on this quest in the first place. And now they were trying to break the deal they had made with him when they left the house. No, I don't. Just turn the car around and let's go home. The sisters had no choice but to give up their mission to change Micah's mind. When they had been driving toward the town, they could only see the backs of the pedestrians. Their slow, methodical walk was weird, but nothing to really be concerned with. But as Corey began turning the car around, the headlights shone on the faces of the travelers. Blank stares. The eyes of every person walking was fixated on the distance ahead of them and what they could make out of their pupils seemed to cover their entire eyes with black. The men, the women, and even the children.
I'm taking the detour. Maybe we can see what's going on from the side street,
Corey decided. Micah sighed. Well, at least they weren't getting out of the car. I guess that was a win. The detour didn't lend any sight to what was actually happening, just more people walking toward the town in unison with the same blank faces and dilated pupils. Now, it wasn't just Micah getting nervous. They could all see the lines of people becoming sporadic. Fewer and fewer people were walking up ahead until there was no one. No cars driving. No one else had taken the detour. No pedestrians. When Corey turned the car around and began heading back to where the police officer was, there was silence in the car. Disbelief. There was no one around, no police officer, no pedestrians, and no one in the streets. Just an empty barricade. The town was dark and empty from what they could see.
I want to get out,
Reagan blurted out. Micah immediately responded, "No, you guys promised we would stay in the car. Take me home now." Corey understood that if she didn't keep her promise to Micah, they would never get another shot at this. Not all three of them, at least. Micah would never agree to that. The drive back was the opposite of the drive to town. The moon had become blocked by clouds, and the stars that were visible were dimmer for some reason. It took them about 10 minutes to reach the town on the drive in, but as soon as they passed the diner and entered the dark road, they were home. None of them remembering the drive down that road. How did we get home? Micah tried to recount the drive.
I don't remember,
Corey responded.
I know I drove us here. Maybe we were just talking and didn't pay attention,
she continued.
Okay, but what were we talking about?
Reagan added. If Micah was the only one slightly uneasy about this adventure when they had left the house, all three were now feeling the same way. They couldn't remember any of it, but somehow they made it safely home, and that's what was important. All three hurried out of the car and into their house, quickly locking the door behind them. They had this strange feeling that they were being watched, measured. There was too much excitement welling up inside them to go straight to bed. Corey pulled out her phone to see the many missed calls and messages from just about everyone she knew. She had a bad habit of not responding to texts in the past, but she always read them with the intention of responding when she could. But this time, the time confused her. They couldn't have been gone for more than 30 minutes, but it was now midnight, and the date stamps were weird on her texts. She told the other two to check their phones, and there was the same thing. All three had many missed calls and texts. The date stamps were showing a 24-hour span which the texts were received, and all the texts said the same things. Hey, are you okay? We can't get a hold of you. Quickly, they all started responding to the texts. The last thing they needed was for anyone to think they were missing, and this date was just really weird. When the family members and friends were calmed, they all sat and tried to remember what had happened on that drive. None of them could. Frantically, they started arguing, each putting the blame off on the other. They tried thinking of logical explanations of what had happened, but it was Micah who spoke up with a solution. Corey, you complained about feeling dizzy and tired as soon as we got out of town. You asked Reagan and I if one of us could drive, but we were feeling the same way. So you must have pulled over and we probably all fell asleep. Part of which was true. Corey had felt tired and dizzy. He pieced the rest of it together out of speculation.
Micah, you're making this up,
Reagan snapped. No, I'm not. That's what happened. Of course he was making it up. He couldn't remember any more than his sisters could, but he wanted this to be over. Corey added,
That had to be it. What else could it be? We weren't abducted by aliens or anything.
She was trying to be funny, but it didn't help. They stayed up all night trying to calm each other down. When they were all calm enough, they started making jokes.
Micah, I bet the aliens probed you,"
Reagan said with a laugh. Micah laughed too. "I'm glad I don't remember that." The jokes continued until they were too exhausted to laugh anymore. The next day was now a Sunday. Nowhere to be. No errands to run. And all three decided it was probably just nothing at all the night before, even though they felt deep down that it was something. They were home and safe, and that's what mattered. The next week went as normal. Work schedules, light chores around the house, nothing spectacular. But all three felt something was missing. Something deep inside them was pulling at them. Something dangerous. Yet it was calling to them, nagging at them. All week they had felt it but didn't say anything to one another. But surprisingly, it was Micah who spoke up first. "I want to go back." Corey's heart sank. If he was talking about moving back to the larger town they came from, it would be hurtful to say the least. She worked so hard to get this house and wasn't willing to leave it.
"What do you mean? Go back where?"
Micah took a deep breath. It was going to be hard to get these words out of his mouth. "Back to town." Corey and Reagan were shocked. Micah wasn't one to want to do something like this. Originally, he had been the one to try to discourage them. As the words broke free of his mouth, he instantly regretted saying it. He wanted to take it back immediately, but it was too late. The girls were not excited over his decision, but had this deep burning that it had to be done. So, reluctantly, they began making plans to return that night.
"Micah, can we get out of the car this time? I really feel like I need to know what's going on,"
Reagan said. Micah protested for a moment, but his inhibitions didn't last long. He felt like he needed to see what was happening in town just as much as they did. But keeping in mind what happened the week prior, he wanted to be really cautious. "I guess, but if anything seems too weird, we're leaving." They weren't expecting him to say yes, actually. They quickly agreed to his terms. That night, they loaded into the car. Again, Micah didn't protest when Reagan announced that she would be in the front seat. He regretted saying anything about wanting to go back to the town. Even though it was a warm evening, he felt cold, unnaturally cold. His sisters were feeling it too, but they weren't going to let on. Curiosity and the draw of whatever was going on in that town was getting to them. Their hearts beated faster with every move toward their goal. Fear was starting to set in as well. The drive to town was the same as the first time. It took an unusually long amount of time to reach the diner. The wind was swaying the trees, which had been lit up by the bright moon. As they drove the main strip, the barricade was once again in place with the same police officer standing as a sentry. Instead of approaching the barricade this time, they pulled into one of the parking lots to the left. Micah sat quietly in the back the whole time. He didn't want to do this anymore, but it was Reagan who first displayed her second thoughts.
"Are we sure we want to do this? I have a bad feeling, Corey."
Corey had been feeling the same way, but she figured they were already there, and who knows if they would ever agree on this again. She thought there was a good chance it was actually nothing, and they would get a good laugh at how afraid they were later on. Micah answered quickly, "I don't want to do this." Corey looked back at him.
"This was your idea."
"I know, it just doesn't feel right." Reagan agreed with Micah, but figured she had to put this to rest. She kept telling herself there's nothing to worry about. Corey responded again.
"I know, but we're already here, and look, there are a lot of people around."
Micah had already surveyed the pedestrians. "Yeah, look at them. They are like zombies or something, all of them." By the time he got the words out, Corey had already opened her door. With deep sighs, Reagan and Micah followed suit. They couldn't let their sister walk into whatever this was alone. She had always been there to protect them growing up, and now they had to be there for her this time. Slowly, the siblings walked toward the section of street that was cordoned off, not talking, all three feeling the pull getting stronger. Their surroundings slowly became darker with each step. Their toes and fingertips began tingling, and the feeling radiated throughout their entire bodies from there. Tunnel vision set in. The focal point was straight ahead, nothing in particular, just forward. It was like something had taken over their bodies. Their minds were free to wander, but they were powerless over their movements, like walking during sleep paralysis. Inside, all of them were afraid, more afraid than they had ever been, feeling darkness encapsulate them until they noticed it. The hordes of pedestrians were all gone. There was no one around. The street was empty and dark, yet they couldn't stop walking. Each sibling was terrified, but couldn't speak a word, catatonic. Tears rolled down their cheeks. This was a mistake, and somehow they had let this happen to them, even invited it. If there was a yearning to see what was going on before they had been walking, that was all gone now. They just wanted to go home. Fully aware of their surroundings, their thoughts, and their feelings, they were helpless in their movements. Reagan tried moving her fingers to no good result. Corey thought if she could get the energy mustered to scream, that this may break the cycle. Nothing. Micah tried to pivot his feet to face in the opposite direction, but he too was powerless. It was like being in a waking nightmare for all three of them. The street became darker and darker until they could barely see each other. Becoming separated from one another was the worst thing that could happen at this moment. Then, just as they were forced to stop walking, complete darkness. Blackness surrounded them. The darkness lasted for no more than a minute, but it seemed like an eternity. Suddenly, there was a flash of brilliant white light. The street lit up just as quickly as the flash brightened the entire town. Reagan's finger moved, Micah's feet began to pivot, and Corey let out a scream. All three collapsed to the ground like marionettes whose strings were cut as they heaved to draw in as much air as they possibly could. They looked over at one another. They were in control of their bodies again, gathering the strength to get back to their feet. They couldn't help but notice the town seemed alive again. The street lights had once again came on, and there were people everywhere. Some were in the same state as the siblings, trying to catch their bearing. Most were, well, they had been here a long time. By some of the appearances, they had been here 100 years or more. People dressed in all eras of garb, from long dresses and waistcoats to more modern outfits. The most modern were mostly trying to get back to their feet. The others, it was obvious they weren't among the living. All three immediately pulled out their phones. No service. Not even a date nor time was displayed on the screens. It was more like they were trapped in a time before these contraptions were invented. While phones had been a vice for all three before this was the time they really needed them for their true purpose. Reagan tried the camera. She wanted to at least try to sneak a picture of what was going on, but the only image it displayed was a bright white screen. Corey and Micah tried the same thing with the same result. Slight glows of blue light surrounded the almost transparent forms of these spirits as they gathered around to greet the newcomers. Micah got to his feet and he turned. As he did, a man stood before him, not a foot from him.
I tried warning you. You didn't listen.
The man was wearing what appeared to be clothing from a bygone time. Micah couldn't tell exactly when, but he knew no one dressed like that in a very long time. Next to the man stood a much shorter figure, a child, a young boy. Sadness draped both of their faces. Micah replied, quivering, "I want to go home."
Not yet, son. They haven't had their fun with you yet.
Reagan and Corey spun around to see who Micah was talking to. A woman from behind grabbed Corey as she pulled away with a jerking motion. Reagan grabbed her brother and sister's hands and began running out of instinct, pulling them back the direction they came. The crowd closed in around them as they bolted past anyone trying to stop them. Then they stopped. Other newcomers had joined them in their exit, but all stopped suddenly. They were back at the town center somehow. The crowd of spirits drew closer slowly, as if they were in no hurry because the siblings couldn't go out anyway. Corey shouted, "This way!" as she saw something familiar. A road. The road that would lead to the parking lot where her car had been parked. It was only a few blocks away in the distance. She could barely see it, but it was there. There were at least 6 other people joining the race to get out. The further they ran, the more people joined them, running harder and faster with each step. The road seemed to get farther and farther away until suddenly, forest. Somehow they were in the middle of a forest, as if the rest of the town disappeared and was replaced by the rustling of trees. A tiny light flickered in the distance as if a single flame from a candle was calling to them. The group found the strength to sprint toward it. Reagan was still grasping Corey and Micah's hands like a vice. One by one, those who followed them began trailing off and disappearing into the darkness, as if they just ceased to exist, until all that was left was a mother carrying her toddler, crying uncontrollably as she desperately tried to keep up, nearly falling as she tripped over fallen branches. Micah used his free hand to help the woman steady herself. As the flame drew closer, the silhouette of a single building began materializing, an old abandoned plantation home. The remnants of a time that brought so much suffering was now the single hope of survival for the remaining escapees, or at least they perceived. Corey recognized this structure. It lay just on the other side of the train tracks, less than a mile from their home. She knew they were on the right track to making it home. Reagan stopped abruptly, out of breath and lack of adrenaline to push her forward. The house was still a short distance away, but she just couldn't move. Turning to look behind them, she could see the spirits were nowhere in sight. The ones who had been chasing them must have given up, she thought as she tried to desperately catch her breath. Corey, Micah, and the woman begged Reagan to keep going, but she just couldn't. Her legs felt as if they weren't attached to her body and she could collapse at any moment. Micah was feeling it too. He couldn't keep running. "It looks like those things are gone," he let out, trying to catch his breath. "Can we just rest for a moment?" The group agreed. There didn't seem to be anyone coming for them, and the house was now within walking distance. Corey finally spoke up, trying to rally the others. "We have to keep moving." There had been no time to register what had happened. In the tree line, where they had come from, Micah saw the pale, glowing lights of the spirits moving slowly, creeping toward them through the woods. Fear planted itself firmly within Micah's entire being as he gathered his strength and urged the others to begin at least walking toward the old house. Out of breath and ready to give up, the group began moving again, stumbling. It was everything Reagan could do to put one foot in front of the other, and any step she did take seemed fruitless, like this was some kind of sick game that would never end in their victory. For every 2 steps forward, it seemed they took 1 step back. For whoever these ghosts were, they were in no real hurry to actually capture them, just scare them. As they approached the old house, getting closer, the candlelight that had been a beacon for them abruptly went out. The woman that had been tagging along put her child on the ground in front of the siblings, turned to them, and spoke.
We tried to warn you, but you didn't listen. Now we've had our fun.
At that very moment, sunlight began peeking through the trees, and the woman and her child vanished, leaving a pale blue mist in their wake. As the sun rose, the house too disappeared. The forest, the spirits, all of it, gone. The siblings were now standing by their car in the parking lot in town. Confused, but not ready to stay another moment, they all hurried into the car. Corey barely got in her seat when she fired up the engine and threw the gear shift into drive. She sped off out of the parking lot and onto the main road. As light began to brighten the street, The town was returning to normal. Micah couldn't help but wonder, what is normal now? Half the day the town was full of life and warmth, small town living. The other half, well, it was the opposite. When their phones regained service, there was no one asking where they were, or if they were okay. It was Reagan who noticed it first. It was Sunday morning, actually, the morning of the evening they left to go back to the town. They didn't lose time on the trip as they had on the first trip. Instead, they gained back several hours, almost a complete day. It took some time before anyone spoke. The drive home was spent mostly in silence. After unlocking the front door and stepping through it, they all felt that everything was different, brighter somehow. Even though the siblings were exhausted from the night prior, none of them could sleep for several hours. When they did finally sleep, Micah had dreams of the man and his son. The spirits tried to warn him not to go into town at night. Why hadn't he listened in the first place? In his dream, the two spirits told him,
"Welcome to Walton, Kentucky."
They smiled and turned to walk away. It left Micah feeling a little bit at peace. Over the next few weeks, the siblings talked about what had happened that night. They discussed moving from the town, but decided against it. As a test to whether they should pack up and go, they decided to drive to town one last time at night, this time as only spectators. Their plan was to drive toward the town and turn around and drive away once they were in sight of the barricade. But when they reached the spot, there was no barricade. No people lining the streets single file. Nothing. They drove straight through the town with no incident. Whatever had happened to them that day weeks ago, it must be over. Some darker power's idea of a sick, twisted initiation into this town. Well, they had earned the right to stay, and they weren't going anywhere.